Hey everyone, John here. Welcome back to Wheels, where we are once again in front of a Volkswagen ID.4. But this time, as you can tell, we're not in a studio. We're out here at a private facility that sort of simulates an Australian country road. And that's because we're going to get to drive this car for the first time on Australian soil, and that's something to get excited about. It's still a long way from finally being released in Australia, this Volkswagen ID.4, with a suspected launch date towards the end of 2023, but its expected starting price here in Australia of 60 to 65 grand makes it a pretty enticing proposition next to rivals such as the Hyundai Ioniq 5, Kia EV6, Tesla Model Y, and Volvo XC40 Recharge. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight into the driver's seat and see how this car handles an Australian back road. Let me know your thoughts on the Volkswagen ID.4 in the comment section down below, and let's get into it. So we're here on our first drive on a simulated Australian country road. It's an old highway patrol training facility in the Volkswagen ID.4. It's pretty exciting. This is a car that's really going to be a big deal for Volkswagen. And the first thing we're going to do is take it from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour. I'm in sport mode, got my foot on the brake, plant the gas, off we go. 40, 60, 80, and there's 100. Now that's not that fast, but I guess that's kind of the idea of this thing. It's a Volkswagen Tiguan that's electric. That really is what this vehicle's all about, being a great family SUV. As we saw in the back already, this thing is a pretty well packaged vehicle. I do think it suffers a little bit not having quite the same adjustability as Tiguan, but perhaps we'll see that coming along in the future. It really does a lot with the space that it has thanks to that really long wheelbase. That also makes it feel quite planted out here on the road, and I'm not going to say it sparkles dynamically, but it is very consistent, reassuring, and just feels all of a piece. Feels very much like a Volkswagen product. Now this car I'm in right now is sort of the range-topping car if you're not talking about the performance GTX variants. It is the UK spec Pro Performance. That means it has a single electric motor mounted on the rear axle, so it's a rear-wheel drive Volkswagen. I actually quite like that, and you can feel its rear-wheel drive nature as you drive out of corners, as we'll do in just a second. And that motor develops 150 kilowatts of power and 310 newton meters of torque. Now, as you saw, that's not going to set your world on fire when you take off from a set of lights, but it is a handy amount of power. And the drivetrain calibration in this ID.4, I happen to think, is pretty good. Now personally, and I think a few of you EV fans out there will probably share this opinion with me, I think that the regen braking programming could be a little bit more aggressive in this car. It is quite lax, and it doesn't bring the ID.4 to a complete stop ever. It only sort of slows you down to a reasonable speed. You then need to jump on the brakes, which has this cute little pause emblem on it, as though it's sort of like a video game. Now, I do find myself thinking that a more aggressive regen program would be great. There is only one stage, and that extra flexibility is something I'd like to see in the future, but perhaps that's actually what people who are already driving combustion cars want from a vehicle like this. Something that's not too weird, not too crazy like a Tesla Model Y or a Polestar 2, because ultimately it does feel like this car is pretty user-friendly once you've got your head wrapped around the slightly odd shifter and the fact that all you need to do when you get into this car is put your foot on the brake and it starts up for you. Now let's talk a little bit more about the handling. This Pro Performance model has progressive steering, and that feels quite nice, firm, reasonably accurate, and a nice quick steering rack. No real feel, of course. It's electric, as the entire car is, but you know, it goes around corners pretty nicely, turns in with a good amount of vigor, and the chassis feels pretty balanced. Now I will say that the suspension settings in the ID.4 are perhaps a little firm. It's very hard to tell on this kind of track because although it looks like a regular Australian country road, I can tell you that there's actually a lot less bumps in this road than there are out there in the real world. And our man Jez Spinks did drive one of these in the UK and perhaps wasn't super impressed by the amount of ride comfort offered by it. But again, that's all going to have to wait until we get to spend a little bit more time in this car. And for the moment, I think it's going to be pretty decent. If I did have some criticisms I can point out about this car's noise, vibration and harshness though, it is the fact that although road noise is really well insulated on these Pirelli tyres, even though they are pretty big. 235 55 19s up front and 255 50 19s at the rear, so they're going to be expensive to replace. There is quite a lot of noise from the rear suspension. There's like a boomy resonance that makes its way through the cabin. Perhaps that's because it's an electric car and you notice that a little bit more. I've definitely found that in Volvo and Polestar products, that you can hear that sort of boomy resonance a bit more pronounced than in perhaps a combustion car, but this car doesn't have a torsion beam. It is an independent rear suspension, so perhaps could be due with being a little bit quieter than it is. But hey, ultimately the refinement in this car is so good that maybe that's why it comes to the fore a little bit more. Now, as for visibility, forward visibility I think is really rather good. There's quite thin A-pillars here, so you can really spot everywhere you need to go. There's an extra little bit of corner glass in there, so that doesn't get in your way. But you do sit quite low in the ID.4, and the bonnet is fairly high, as is the rest of the belt line, especially around the rear three-quarter. Luckily, that's kind of offset by a pretty crisp and very legible 360-degree camera in this Pro Performance. Now, it's probably the case that we're going to get that in Australia, because that's the sort of thing you expect from a top spec model that's going to cost, you know, between 60 to 70 grand once it arrives here in late 2023. So I think we can definitely expect that. The other things to expect are the full IQ Drive program of driver assistance aids. That means adaptive cruise control with Volkswagen's level 2 autonomy system called Highway Travel Assist, which combines the standard lane departure warning and lane trace assist with adaptive cruise control for seamless highway driving. This car also has the touch capacitive steering wheel, meaning you don't have to grab the steering wheel to make it know that you're driving the car. You can just keep your hands on there and it'll know. That's all great stuff. Forwards AEB with junction, cyclist and pedestrian detection, and we've got reverse AEB, front and rear parking sensors as well. So that's a really quick look at the Volkswagen ID.4. It looks promising. Whether it's going to revolutionize the electric market, I'm not sure. We'll have to find out shortly when we get a proper road test on this car later next year. So stay tuned for that. So that's our first taste in Australia of the ID.4 on the road out of the way, but let's have a quick recapitulation on a couple of design elements and packaging interesting quirks of this car before we jump inside the interior. So starting at the front end, it really debuts Volkswagen's ID design, following on from the ID.3. It doesn't really look like a Volkswagen Tiguan at all, even though that is the kind of vehicle it's replacing. At just over 4.5 meters long, it is definitely a mid-size SUV. It's got this white badging, which is exclusive to ID cars, a really cool full-width LED signature that ties the car together and emphasizes its width because it is quite a wide car on the road. As we come down the side, you can tell it apart from more cooking variants. This is the Pro Performance, a UK spec car, so it's not entirely indicative of what we're going to get in Australia, but it is pretty close. The blue colorway as well, I think, is quite handsome. Reminds me a little bit of the lapis blue color that you see on our products. We've also got 19-inch alloy wheels that look quite aerodynamic, and I'm sure they are, because that's kind of the whole thing about this ID vehicle. It's about being aerodynamic and efficient. And that's why we've got these door handles, which, as far as I'm aware, are the first time that Volkswagen has departed from having sort of outside door handles since the Beetle. This is a real step into being aerodynamic. And I should mention the doors on this ID.4 are really heavy. It feels solid and sturdy in the construction of the body outside. We'll see how that continues inside in a minute. As we come around the back of the ID.4, it is a slightly more practical SUV shape, though it does slope away quite aggressively. You do have a big high body line, as I discussed in the driving as well. That belt line really does kick up. Looks handsome, perhaps not so great for visibility. There is going to be an ID.5 coming at the same time as well, slightly swoopier coupe design, which looks pretty cool. Now onto the charging flap, which is actually very much like you'd see in an internal combustion engine Volkswagen. It's just here down the flank, no shoutiness, not at the front, not at the back, not sort of in pride of place. It just fits into your lifestyle where you would expect to find something like this on a car, and I think that really cuts to the core of the ID.4. It's an electric car for someone who's coming out of a combustion car who doesn't want too much change. Now under this flap we have provisions for a CCS Type 2 cable, so you can DC fast charge this thing at a rate of 125 kilowatts, and that's going to mean you can get from 0 to 80% of charge in around 33 minutes if you can find a quick enough charger. That's not quite as fast as some of this car's rivals, such as the Hyundai Ioniq 5, which can do the same juicing up in just 18 minutes with its 200 plus kilowatt fast charging capabilities, but still it's pretty decent, and it'll mean you can get yourself on the way on the highway in this car. On to range as well, and this ID.4 in Pro Performance model is actually capable of a really impressive range number, over 520 kilometers in the WLTP combined cycle. Of course, when we get to test this thing out on proper Australian roads, we'll be sure to give a full range test, but from a 77 kilowatt hour usable lithium-ion battery, I think that's a pretty good amount of range for a country like Australia, especially as charging infrastructure finally begins to start catching up to the electric revolution here. But you can let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below whether 500 plus Ks is enough range. Now, Volkswagen also offers a slightly smaller range battery pack under 50 kilowatt hours that will probably come to Australia as well, but it's this larger range vehicle that Volkswagen is anticipating more private buyers are going to be interested in. So jumping inside the ID.4, this vehicle we're in here is a UK spec Pro Performance variant. It's pretty indicative of what we'll get in Australia, but specifications haven't been entirely finalised. And I know that there's a couple of things like the seat materials and a couple of trim pieces that are probably up for changing before this comes to Australia later next year. But we can still get a really good idea of what the ID.4 is going to be like from the interior of this car, starting with the technology. Up here, we've got a really generously sized 12.5-inch digital touchscreen, and that is really rather responsive when it's up and running. It certainly feels like it's backed by a higher power processor than in the Golf small car that has been a source of little annoyance. It does seem to take a little bit longer on boot up, but that may be down to the fact that this UK car doesn't have connection to an Australian mobile network for the connected services that's slowing it down a little bit. In this touchscreen though, we do have wireless Apple CarPlay, and that is a really great thing to see. Now, the other thing is that there are almost no buttons in this interior. All of the controls are pretty much in this little touchscreen or the bezel just here. We do have a couple of shortcuts, driver assist, drive mode, and climate controls. They're all up here, but you do at least have little temperature adjustments here just under the touchscreen. It's something you're probably going to get yourself wrapped around as you start to own this car for a little bit longer. But for people who drive a lot of cars, it can be nice just to have physical controls that you can interact with super easily. But as I said, if it's your car, you'll probably understand it pretty quickly. There will be things like navigation as well rolled into the touchscreen, which is really great. Now, that navigation point does bring me to the digital display ahead of me as the driver. And this, I feel like, is actually a bit of a step backwards from current combustion engine Volkswagen vehicles, because it's not a 10.25-inch digital IQ display, it is an ID display. And that means there's no provisions for showing Volkswagen's own mapping software, no satellite mapping here in the digital cockpit. And that was always something that Volkswagen did really well. So I do think it's a little bit of a shame to have lost that. But up here, we do have Volkswagen sort of trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit on how you start the car and interact with the shifter and the gearbox, although it is pretty ashamedly copied from a BMW i3 up here, the little shift toggle. In reality, it works quite well. I really like the fact that you can just sit in this car. It knows that you're present by the weight sensor in the seat, and it moves the Ergo Comfort seat forwards for you. Then you just put your foot on the brake, which has a little cute symbol of a pause button, and the accelerator a little play button, and the car comes to life, and then just shift into drive and off you go. Much like you would do in a Tesla or a Polestar or a Volvo electric product, there's no need to touch the start-stop button. But if you want to, you can in the Volkswagen as well, because the start-stop button is still just here. Now, moving on from technology, let's talk about the practicalities of the Volkswagen ID.4, because being based on the MEB platform without having to deal with combustion engines, gearboxes or anything like that really opens up to the cabin to having a lot of clever touches. The door bins to start with are flock-lined, great to see Volkswagen return to that. And you've got this center console, which is quite modular. You can move the cup holders in here down under the covered storage if you wish, and all of the things you need to connect your phone and charge devices are sort of housed within here. It feels quite logical and well laid out, and it also adds a sense of airiness. You're not so cocooned down in a cabin. You're actually in quite an open and airy space that's really added to as well through this roof here. Finally, let's talk about the seats, which are very comfortable. They're electrically adjustable with 3-position memory. They're Volkswagen's Ergo Comfort seats, really nice. They've got 3-stage heating. The steering wheel's also heated, and that's going to give you plenty of comfort for cold days. And yeah, they feel supportive. When you're going around corners, they hold you in nicely. Plus, they have the added benefit of having these little captain's chair armrests, which I happen to really like, though I know other people have different opinions. So let me know yours in the comment section down below. Now, being a family SUV, the backseat really matters, especially when you're taking over from the Volkswagen Tiguan, which is a very impressively packaged vehicle. So, does the ID.4 replace the Tiguan? In terms of space, yes, I have a really decent amount of headroom at 188 centimeters tall, and behind my own driving position, I have heaps of knee room as well. There's also a flat floor, which means it's easy to sit across the bench. Of course, there's a skateboard of batteries underneath this thing, and that just means packaging is pretty simple. The only real drawback from that skateboard of batteries is the fact that you don't have the greatest toe room under the seat in front of me. I've got pretty small shoes on right now, but if you were wearing big boots like Blundstones or something like that, that does happen in Australia, then you might feel a little bit less comfortable. Still, it's pretty good back here. The bench is decently supportive, and I actually have a really nice amount of under-thigh support here compared to a lot of other electric vehicles, which really lack in that department. As for amenities, we've got a nice fold-down armrest with 2.5 cup holders, standard Volkswagen fare. You've also got a ski port pass-through. Of course, you probably won't be getting that far in the snow with just a rear-wheel drive ID.4, so perhaps we'll have to wait for the all-wheel drive GTX to go ski testing in this thing. Other amenities include a separate climate zone back here, 2 air vents down there, and a further 2 USB-C fast charging ports for a total of 4 in this car. Really nice stuff. You've also got this clever little pocket here, great for carrying a mobile device outside of your pocket on a longer road trip. The only real miss back here is that the ID.4 goes to scratchy plastic in the back here. But considering that it's going to go on sale for between 60 to 65 grand for an EV with over 500 Ks of range, I actually think I'd probably put up with a slightly scratchy plastic for the value that it sort of seems to offer from the outset, because that much range at that price seems like a pretty great deal to me. Under this Pro Performance variant's standard power tailgate, the ID.4 packs 543 litres of boot space. That is actually really competitive in the EV class, more than something like a Hyundai Ioniq 5 and a lot more than a Mustang Mach-E. It's pretty comparable on space to something like a Volkswagen Tiguan and is slightly larger than a Toyota RAV4. It's also quite nicely finished back here. You've got these clever little storage pockets off to the side, and we've got a net in here. Whether that'll be standard for the Australian market is yet to be confirmed, but we hope so. There's also the provision for a little bit of storage under the floor, which is a really great spot to put your standard included Mode 2 home charging and Mode 3 public charging cables for your electric vehicle. All great stuff. There's unfortunately no space for a spare tyre, which could be a slight issue in a market like Australia, but there is space for a tyre repair kit and an inflator, so that should get you out of a bind if you need it. Though of course you can let me know your thoughts down below on the spare tyre versus puncture repair kit debate. And yeah, that's the ID.4's boot. Really decently spacious. This car is actually pretty well packaged. It does perhaps lack a little bit of customizability because the rear seat doesn't slide forwards and backwards like you'd see in a Tiguan, which maybe is a little bit of a turn off, but still great boot, decent back seat, and fairly functional front cabin. Now, I can't give a final verdict on the Volkswagen ID.4 from a half-hour test drive on a facility that is indicative of an Australian country road, but isn't really one. There's not that many bumps here. But what I can say is, having sampled Volkswagen's first ID product coming to Australia, that this is an easy EV to get your head wrapped around. There's no aggressive one-pedal driving mode, and all of the touch surfaces feel very much like a modern, contemporary Volkswagen product, just like a Golf or just like a Tiguan. It doesn't change the game in the same way that Tesla Model Y does. It doesn't challenge your perceptions of what an interior can do, but it just feels exactly what you would want from a Volkswagen. And so, if you're not a first wave electric adopter, but rather someone who's got themselves a Tiguan and wants to move into an electric vehicle in the next car you purchase, then I think you're going to feel really comfortable in Volkswagen's ID range. But if you want something a little bit more out there, a little bit wilder, then there's plenty of other options on the market. Of course, we've got to hold final judgment until we've tested this car for a proper week in Australia in final Australian specification, which we'll hopefully be doing towards the middle/end of next year. So make sure you're subscribed to Wheels here on YouTube and follow us on all our social channels so you don't miss any of our Volkswagen ID content coming up. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ID.4 in the comments section down below, and if you haven't done so already, we'd also love it if you could hit subscribe.